Okay, so I would like to talk about a subject which is very interesting for me. It's a little bit different from the usual things I talk about, but I think it's a good vocal point. I was doing work earlier today, proofreading some work for someone, and one of the things that I was checking was well, the term 21st century was mentioned in the context. It was actually a report about the company Toyota and its marketing strategies, etc. But that's not the point. The terminology in the 21st century came about, and that got me thinking about something: how we determine time, how we determine this generation, this era that we are living in. And I think it can be quite quite contrasted, or I think it could be contrasted to the sort of terminology we used in the 20th century. And actually, when it comes to the naming of decades, that's something that began actually in the late 19th century. I watched an old Cary Grant Mae West film recently called She Done Him Wrong. That was produced in 1933, in that brief period of the pre-code Hollywood era. But basically, in the opening of the film, this is basically about a kind of singer performer in the 1890s New York City. And in the film, the introduction reads as in the glorious 90s. This is referring to the 1890s. So that sort of terminology of referring to decades as unique blocks of time actually began um, in the early 20th century to refer to the final decades of the 19th century. And then throughout the 20th century, every decade became very unique in its own right. Now, what I mean by that is unique in many different aspects, politically speaking, of course, but also in terms of popular culture. For example, the sort of films that developed, the sort of films that were released, in terms of fashion, in terms of um, well, so many different aspects. Automobiles, for instance, uh, change from decade to decade, technology, science. The list goes on, really. Um, as an example of what I'm talking about, you can take any decade of the 20th century and automatically, certainly in Western countries, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, but you can automatically kind of associate something with it. Say, for example, I say the 1920s, people will almost automatically think of jazz music. They will think of politically President Coolidge, President Harding, President Hoover, at least the first part of his administration. They might think of flapper girls, that sort of style, women having short hairstyles. I think it's associated as a time of increasing women's liberation insofar as women could do things that would have been frowned upon in previous decades, like smoking. Cars were probably becoming more popular. Film was still silent. So that's just an example. If I say 1960s, we think of hippie counterculture. We think of the rise of sort of the cultural generation gap between young and old, i.e., between the wartime generation and young people getting involved in all sorts of social movements. We think of flower power. We think of typical hippie fashion. Um, 1980s, you sort of think of Reaganomics, etc., etc. So I don't need to give many more examples. I think it's quite obvious the sort of traction I'm talking about, and not just in the United States, in other Western countries. For example, in the UK, we associate the 1990s with Britpop, with the rise of New Labour, Tony Blair, etc. There's countless examples of how decades can be sort of divided into aspects of culture and politics. I do think this is something that is particularly common with Anglo Saxon countries, by which I mean English speaking countries. um, I don't think it's so common in France, based on what I've seen. I think I remember asking a French friend about this, and I'm not sure if it was just a misunderstanding, but she didn't really know how to explain, for example, how France regards different decades. Obviously, people will look back on different presidencies or different political eras, and you can see that in any country, but I think this thing about determining a particular decade is very apparent with the US, the UK, maybe Australia and Canada, maybe not so common in other countries. And that's not that there hasn't been a change in other countries, but maybe it's just that decades as a concept are just not as seen as important as we see them in the West. I always think of the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire. That goes through all the events of his lifetime up until the point he wrote that song. So we're talking 1946, I believe he was born, to 19, actually, it might have been 49 he was born, up until about 1990 when he wrote the song. Um, in the UK, it's very common to have themed parties like 1970s theme, 1960s theme, 1920s theme. In fact, my old house, we've had a 1920s themed party. Very, very common. A popular thing nowadays is kind of mixed CDs, but specifically focusing on a particular decade. If you just bear with me a second, I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about. Um, if you can read that, Heroes and Sweethearts. Basically, this is World War II music, so we sort of it's a very romanticized image, of course, sort of showing a woman saying goodbye or saying welcoming back her soldier. There's the old steam train. So this immediately has connotation to World War II. 1980s, the 1980s mix CD, so it's all music from the 1980s and 1950s. And you see, even the font is kind of done in a way like you immediately think of a sort of American diner from the 50s. You think of Greece or something like that. So the way we determine decades as part of cultural identity is very, very strong, I feel, especially in the US and the UK. So my question is this, or my reflection is this. In the 20th century, each decade was very, very unique. Now, in the 21st century, and I know there's a whole debate about when exactly it began, 1st of January 2000 or the 1st of January 2001, I think that one thing that is interesting is that the end part of a decade is much more similar to the early part of the next decade than than the rest of the decade. What I mean by that is the year 2000 has a lot more in common, for example, in music and other aspects to 1999 than it does to, say, 2008. Likewise, people often, there's a saying that the 1960s didn't really begin until 1968, I believe is the year that's often given, because the early 1960s was still very much like the 50s in terms of being quite a conservative society. Obviously, there was Kennedy's New Frontier of America, but in many other respects, it was still very much like the 50s. You still had black and white TV, you still had a lot of the things that we associate with the 60s are actually the late 60s. The hippie movement, sometimes forgotten, only began in the late 60s, not the early 60s. Um, so then in that regard, really it's more the 1970s that can be associated with that. Um, Likewise, 2010 would probably be closely associated to the late 2000s. But actually, this is the area I want to look at. We use the terminology the 2000s as the decade from 2000 to 2009, and the current decade that we are in, the 2010s. I think that's the most commonly accepted terminology. But I feel that the last decade and this decade have kind of run into one another in a way that is less hard to distinguish than the decades of the 20th century. Now, that's not to say that this hasn't been an eventful 6 years so far up to, well, actually, we're in the seventh year now. it's been a very eventful few years, and I actually believe that every decade is in one way or another. But when we look at the sort of things that have gone on in the world, the global recession, the Arab Spring, which has then turned into Arab Winter, and I'm only talking about the political issues, it has been very eventful. Politically, obviously, there's a lot of differences between the character of George Bush and the character of Barack Obama. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is because we also associate decades with political personalities that dominated them. So you immediately think of the American president, the British prime minister, etc. Probably the Russian president, but a lot of what I mean, when I think of music, for example, or fashion, not that I'm an expert, but I find it very difficult to distinguish between the 2000s and the 2010s. I don't think there is a very big difference. Whereas you can hear music from the 50s, you would immediately know it's from the 50s. You hear music from the 70s, you would immediately know it's the 70s. You could listen to music from the mid noughties, the mid 2000s, and music from this year, and in my humble opinion, it would be actually quite difficult to distinguish between the two. Likewise, fashion. I mean, unless you're involved heavily in the fashion industry, I don't think it's something that immediately comes to mind. In a way, not in the same way that you could immediately identify, for example, 60s fashion. So, in some ways, this is like a very long decade. It's almost like a 20-year decade, which obviously goes against the definition of what a decade is. But I often associate like this time 2000 as not ending in 2009, but as a continuous ongoing process. Many people, of course, argue that the 21st century or the 2000s began with 9/11, politically speaking, because that, whatever it was, 19-month period of the first part of the decade, not that it was uneventful, but it was sort of like the end of the 90s. It was sort of like, politically speaking, the end of the 90s. There really wasn't that much difference. It was really 9/11 that shaped the politics, the geopolitics of the next decade. And that's arguably still going on. Arab Spring has shaped this decade, but again, you could argue that a lot of the events around Arab Spring are closely related to the events around the so called War on Terror. So the point I'm making is that, I mean, it is true that there were decades in the 20th century that kind of ran into one another in terms of some things being similar, the 60s and the 70s, the 80s and the 90s. Well, the 2000s and the 2010s arguably run into one another. And that's not to say that there hasn't been some big changes from this decade into that. There has, but to me, it's going to be harder for people in the future to tell major differences, for example, in fashion or you know, I just think that's something that's quite noticeable that there is not drastic changes. And another aspect about the last 16 years is that certainly with music, with fashion, and with other aspects, it can arguably be seen as a real mix up of all the previous decades combined. I mean, you can find aspects of all the decades of the 20th century all mixed together in the music, in the fashion of the last 16 years. Obviously, there is new developments, but I think that's something that's quite noticeable. Some things that can be associated with recent years, of course, is the development of YouTube and Facebook. Social media has expanded, the internet has absolutely boomed in a way that we've never seen before. The world is more interconnected than ever before. There is changing socio-economic, political situations, but something like the rise of China was very apparent in the 2000s as well. So there are some things that really are a continuation. Um, I mean, the term 2010s is not really that widely spoken about, although that is that we are in right now. Here in the UK, we are also in a dynasty. We're still a monarchy, and we are actually in the Windsor dynasty, but very, very few people talk about it. We talk about previous dynasties, the Tudors, the Stuarts, and so on. No one actually refers to the Windsor dynasty, or very, very few people do, except royal correspondence. It's a very unspoken of terminology, even though that is the particular period that we are in. Other countries use that sort of terminology. In China, when they had the old kings and emperors, it was like, the Tang dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and so on. In Britain, we also have dynasties, but even though we are living in this Windsor dynasty, very few people even mention it. I suspect if you ask the average person on the street, what dynasty are we in, they wouldn't have a clue. So there is a lot of interesting aspects to how we identify with time as a concept. There are, of course, famous historical events that even people who don't follow politics, who wouldn't have the same level of interest as someone I would have, they would still automatically know about the event because it is such a profound event that you can't escape it. Events like the moon landing, the Kennedy assassination, in the case of the UK, the Queen's coronation. There are certain events that captivate the public imagination for good or bad in a way that even people who aren't interested in politics immediately latch onto. In more recent years, we can think of the death of Princess Diana, 9/11. There are things that people automatically associate with that are profound events. The Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 is another one. The death of Michael Jackson. These are all huge, huge news stories that dominate the headlines for days. The ascension of Barack Obama to the White House. There's so many examples. Well, I say there's so many examples, but there are some events that particularly stand out. And, people always say, I know where I was in 9/11, or I know where I was when Kennedy was assassinated. Something, this is something that people automatically associate with a particular event. Speaking personally, I can think of a lot of major events over the last 15 years and know where I was at the time. So for me, that's probably just because I follow the news so closely. But anyway, and I know where I was at that particular time in my life. Anyway, I'm going to round it up here. Spoke for a bit longer than I intended. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think that there is some crossover between the 2000s and the 2010s? And this terminology of perhaps we're not going to know about the 2000s and the 2010s. I think what might be more, when I say know about, what I mean is the vocabulary. Perhaps 21st century is a more appropriate terminology. So let me know your thoughts. Cheers.